He was a titan of industry with a strong sense of justice. No, we're not talking about Batman. Julius Rosenwald didn't wear a cape or a mask, and he didn't skulk the streets at night looking for bad guys to beat up, at least as far as we know. Instead, he poured his fortune into building schools for black children in the segregated American South, educating future leaders like Maya Angelou, John Lewis, and Medgar Evers. But why would a billionaire businessman dedicate himself to a cause so far from his own world? Julius Rosenwald was born into war. His home state of Illinois sent more than 250,000 soldiers into the Union Army during the Civil War. But the state was no paradise for black Americans. In 1908, Rosenwald's hometown of Springfield was rocked by violent race riots. Just blocks from his childhood home, angry mobs tore apart black neighborhoods, murdering 17 people for no reason beyond racism and hate. Rosenwald was horrified. His parents had fled Germany because of anti-Semitism. But here was a similar hatred infecting the so-called Goldene Medina. America was supposed to be the land of plenty, where the streets were paved with gold, where Jews could live safe and free. So why were black Americans being murdered in the streets as though they were the Jews in Tsarist Russia?
From events around him in the first decade of the 20th century, he was beginning to equate the racial animus in this country with the anti-Semitism and the lack of opportunity that had driven his parents, and of course so many other Jews, to leave Europe.
America had been good to the Rosenwalds. Though Julius's parents struggled to make ends meet with their modest clothing shop, their son had found wild success in the same business. In 1895, he joined Sears, Roebuck Co, where he quickly started making changes. Changes that paid off. He emphasized a customer-focused approach and expanded the Sears catalog to include wide ranges of affordable products, especially for poor and rural Americans. Under his leadership, Sears became a giant in mail-order retail, extending its reach nationwide. Rosenwald's fortune eventually reached $80 million. Today, he'd be a billionaire. Throughout his childhood, Rosenwald had watched his mother cook for the poor. The family might not have had much, but they shared what they had. So as his wealth grew, so did his charity portfolio. And then Rosenwald came across the book that would change his life. 3 years after the race riot that terrorized his hometown, Rosenwald picked up Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery. He was so moved that he reached out to Washington. With his wife and rabbi, he embarked on a tour of the segregated South. Every institution was segregated, even the schools. That meant one school for black children, another for white ones. It was illegal for a black child to go to a white school and vice versa. Separate did not mean equal. The white schools were better funded and better run, with textbooks and well-trained teachers. If a town had a black school at all, which wasn't guaranteed, it was underfunded and sometimes downright unsafe. The roofs leaked, the floors tilted unevenly, the windows were empty with no glass or screens to shut out the elements. If there were any textbooks, they were old and battered. The teachers were poorly trained and even more poorly paid. And there were limits on what they could teach. In some schools, black students weren't allowed access to foundational American documents, like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Black children weren't allowed to know that their country guaranteed them equality under the law. Because then, they'd start asking inconvenient questions, like, why does my school look like this? Why can't I get a real education?
Well, we weren't even allowed to be taught. We weren't really free to do or to think that we could accomplish more.
Booker T. Washington had already established an institute to train black teachers. They needed schools, safe, comfortable, well-funded schools where they could put their training into practice. Within a year of their first meeting, Washington and Rosenwald had teamed up to tackle the problem. They weren't trying to end segregation. That would take time they just didn't have. So even though some criticized Washington as an accommodationist who would rather work within a racist system than make a radical change, the pair pressed on. Look, I get the critics. Who wouldn't want to tear down a terrible system? But that's a lot easier said than done, especially when that system is entrenched by law. And black students, particularly in rural areas, needed an education now. So the businessman and the educator began building schools, starting in Alabama and quickly expanding to serve 15 states. Rosenwald funded the endeavor, but required each community contribute funds and labor. He wasn't trying to save money. He was trying to ensure that the whole community was invested in the school's success. Today we call that sweat equity, feeling like you have a stake in something because you helped to build it. It must have worked, because the schools became pillars in their respective communities. By the 1930s, roughly 1 in 3 black students in the South attended a Rosenwald school. Altogether, that's more than 600,000 young people, including future luminaries like Langston Hughes and Marian Anderson.
There are economists at the Federal Reserve Bank that have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their analysis shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools.
Rosenwald never put his name on any of the schools, though they are unofficially known as Rosenwald schools. He wasn't looking for fame. He just wanted to solve a problem that few people seemed to care about. But everyone understood his underlying reasons for investing so heavily in black causes. It's estimated that half of his charitable gifts went to the black community. The other half was split between donations to universities, museums, and Jewish causes.
When he gave money to create the Museum of Science and Industry, nobody said, oh, he's doing that because he's a Jew. But every time he gave money to any African-American cause, it was in the press, in the mouths of rabbis, in the mouths of African-American commentators, writers. It's because he's a Jew.
Judaism encourages charity, but there's a hierarchy of giving. In fact, the highest form of charity is empowering others to no longer need charity. That was Rosenwald's approach. His give while you live philosophy focused on addressing urgent and immediate needs. Before he died, he established the Rosenwald Fund, including a unique stipulation. The money had to be spent within 25 years of his death. He believed each generation needed to address its own unique challenges. Historian Stephanie Deutsch, who's actually married to Julius Rosenwald's great-grandson, explains that this decision is probably why Rosenwald remains relatively unknown today.
Today, there is a Rockefeller Foundation, there is a Carnegie Endowment, but there is not a Julius Rosenwald Fund. And that was a very specific thing that Rosenwald felt that every generation creates wealth and that wealth should be used for the needs of that generation.
You might not have heard his name before today, but that's because his legacy isn't measured by endowments and funds, but by the hundreds of thousands of lives he transformed.